March 5, 1940. A dense forest outside the village of Katyn, Poland. Major Anatoly Slovtsov of the NKVD receives a classified order that would remain buried for half a century. The document, stamped with Stalin's approval, contains a single directive: execute 25,700 Polish officers, intellectuals, and prisoners of war. No trials, no appeals, just elimination. For 50 years, the Soviet Union would blame the Nazis for what happened in these woods. The truth would challenge everything the world thought it knew about wartime justice and expose a machinery of death that operated across continents with bureaucratic precision. Imagine being Captain Joseph Czapski, one of the few Polish officers to survive Soviet captivity, spending decades searching for his missing comrades, never knowing they lay buried in mass graves just miles from where he was imprisoned. The Second World War created a landscape where atrocities could hide behind the fog of greater conflicts. While the world focused on Nazi crimes, the Soviet Union systematically committed acts that violated every principle of international law. These weren't spontaneous acts of wartime brutality. They were calculated policies, documented in meticulous detail by the very bureaucracy that carried them out. Stalin's regime operated under a different moral framework entirely. Where other nations saw civilians and prisoners of war, Soviet leadership saw potential threats to be eliminated. The NKVD, predecessor to the KGB, functioned as both police force and executioner, carrying out orders with industrial efficiency that would make factory managers proud. The scale defied comprehension. Between 1939 and 1953, Soviet forces systematically murdered, deported, and starved millions of civilians across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and within their own borders. These crimes weren't aberrations of war. They were instruments of policy, as carefully planned as 5-year economic plans and executed with the same bureaucratic thoroughness. The documentation survived because Soviet bureaucrats, even when committing mass murder, maintained detailed records. They filed reports in triplicate. They requested additional resources for ammunition and transport trucks. They documented body counts with the same administrative precision used for factory quotas and grain harvests. This paperwork would later become evidence of systematic brutality that spanned continents. Conservative estimates place Soviet war crimes at over 20 million civilian deaths, a number that exceeds the entire population of Australia, eliminated through policies as methodical as census-taking. What distinguished Soviet war crimes was their systematic nature. This wasn't the heat-of-battle brutality seen in other conflicts. Soviet leadership created detailed operational plans for ethnic cleansing, complete with train schedules, burial site locations, and resource allocation charts. They approached mass murder like urban planning, calculating logistics, measuring efficiency, and optimizing processes. The victims came from every walk of life: Polish intellectuals and Ukrainian farmers, Baltic shopkeepers and Crimean fishermen, German civilians and Soviet citizens deemed politically unreliable. The common thread wasn't ethnicity or religion, it was perceived threat to Soviet power. Anyone who might organize resistance, preserve non-Soviet culture, or simply remember life before communist rule became a target. The pattern emerged early in the war, revealing itself first in Poland. September 1939, as Nazi Germany invaded from the west, the Soviet Union struck from the east. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had secretly divided Poland between the two totalitarian powers. What followed wasn't standard military occupation. It was social engineering through systematic elimination of human beings who represented pre-war Polish society. Soviet forces immediately began identifying and arresting Poland's intellectual and military elite, teachers who might educate future resistance leaders, lawyers who understood constitutional rights, military officers who could organize armed opposition, clergy who provided moral authority independent of the state, civil servants who knew how democratic government functioned. All found themselves loaded onto cattle cars, bound for Soviet prisons. The deportations began with ruthless efficiency. February 10th, 1940. 220,000 Polish civilians, forced from their homes in sub-zero temperatures, given minutes to pack whatever they could carry. April 13th, 1940, another 320,000 deported to Kazakhstan and Siberia, traveling in unheated train cars for weeks. Many died en route, their bodies thrown from moving trains into the wilderness. What if these deportations had been properly documented by international observers at the time? The Soviet Union might have faced war crimes tribunals alongside Nazi Germany, fundamentally altering post-war geopolitics. Soviet efficiency extended to the smallest details. Deportation orders specified that families should be separated, men to labor camps, women and children to special settlements. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was calculated policy designed to prevent coordinated resistance and ensure cultural extinction through family destruction. But the Polish military officers presented a unique problem. As prisoners of war, they enjoyed protection under international law. They couldn't simply disappear without diplomatic consequences. The Soviet solution was characteristically brutal and deceptive. They would murder them systematically and blame someone else entirely. The decision came from the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, personally recommended the executions to Stalin in a detailed memorandum dated March 5, 1940. The memo outlined specific reasons why these prisoners should die rather than remain in Soviet custody. Stalin's approval appears in blue pencil on the original document, physical evidence of his personal authorization for mass murder that would survive in Soviet archives for 50 years. The killing began in April 1940 with methodical precision that revealed the industrial nature of Soviet mass murder. At Kalinin prison, Soviet executioners worked in carefully organized shifts. Each Polish officer was brought individually to a specially prepared soundproofed room. A single bullet to the base of the skull. The bodies were immediately loaded onto trucks and driven to prepared mass graves dug by NKVD personnel. The efficiency was horrifying in its bureaucratic thoroughness. NKVD records, preserved in Stalin's personal files, show they murdered 14,700 Polish officers and intellectuals in just 5 weeks. At Katyn Forest alone, 4,400 bodies would eventually be discovered in perfectly organized rows, but the killings extended far beyond that single location to multiple sites across Soviet territory. The executioners received performance bonuses for their work. Vasily Blokin, Stalin's chief executioner, personally killed 7,000 Polish officers in 28 nights of systematic murder, using a German Walther pistol deliberately chosen so the weapons could later be attributed to Nazi forces. Blokin worked with assembly line efficiency, killing one prisoner every 3 minutes during his shifts. How does a government bureaucracy transform ordinary clerks and policemen into mass murderers who maintain detailed paperwork about their killing quotas? The cover-up began immediately and demonstrated Soviet expertise in manipulating evidence. Authorities planted German ammunition at burial sites. They prepared false documentation dating the murders to 1941 after the German invasion. They photographed the graves from angles that would support their eventual propaganda narrative. When Nazi forces discovered the mass graves in 1943, Soviet propaganda machinery immediately denounced the revelations as German atrocity propaganda designed to divide the Allied coalition. The deception worked perfectly on the international stage. At the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors actually attempted to charge Nazi Germany with the Katyn Massacre, presenting fabricated evidence to support their claims. Only behind closed doors pressure from American and British officials who privately suspected Soviet responsibility based on intelligence reports prevented this complete travesty of justice from proceeding to formal charges. But Katyn represented merely one chapter in a larger, systematic program of brutality that extended across Soviet-controlled territory. In the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Soviet forces conducted massive deportation operations that eliminated entire social classes. Over 200,000 civilians were loaded into cattle cars and shipped to Siberian labor camps where survival rates barely reached 50%. Consider the Baltic families who woke up surrounded by NKVD troops, given 15 minutes to pack for what they were told would be temporary relocation, never to see their homeland again. In Ukraine, as German forces advanced in 1941, NKVD units executed thousands of political prisoners rather than evacuate them or release them. They left bodies stacked in overcrowded prison cells to decompose, creating horrific scenes that German propaganda would later exploit. These weren't hasty wartime decisions. They followed pre-written protocols for eliminating prisoners during retreats. The Crimean Tatars faced complete cultural extinction through systematic deportation. May 18, 1944. Soviet forces surrounded every Crimean Tatar village simultaneously in a carefully coordinated operation involving thousands of troops and hundreds of trains. Within 72 hours, they deported the entire population, over 200,000 people, to Central Asia. Nearly half died within the first year from starvation, disease, and exposure. Entire cultures disappeared overnight. Villages that had existed for centuries became ghost towns within hours, their mosques converted to storage facilities, and their cemeteries bulldozed. The cover-up lasted decades and required constant effort to maintain the fabrication. Soviet authorities buried incriminating documents in the deepest classified archives, accessible only to the highest-level officials. Survivors who spoke about their experiences faced immediate imprisonment or execution. Official history books simply omitted these events entirely, creating a sanitized version of Soviet wartime conduct that portrayed the USSR as purely heroic. When evidence surfaced, despite these efforts, the Soviet response followed an established pattern: deny the facts, deflect blame to others, and systematically destroy any remaining documentation. KGB officers spent years tracking down and eliminating potential witnesses who might testify to Soviet crimes in international forums. The Eastern European satellite states became complicit in maintaining the deception. Polish communist authorities, installed by Moscow after the war, actively suppressed investigation into Katyn and other massacres. They threatened families of victims who demanded answers, effectively making the Polish government accomplice to covering up crimes against Polish citizens. Soviet archives eventually revealed over 40,000 execution orders personally signed by Stalin, each document representing multiple deaths, creating a paper trail of industrial-scale murder spanning 15 years. Many perpetrators lived comfortable, honored lives until natural death. Vasily Blokin, the man who personally murdered 7,000 Polish officers in Katyn-related executions, received the Order of the Red Banner for his service and retired with full state honors. He died peacefully in Moscow in 1955, his crimes unknown to the world, and his family receiving a full state pension. The victims' families endured generations of uncertainty and official lies. Some spent their entire lives never learning their loved one's fate, dying without closure or the ability to properly mourn. Mass graves continue to be discovered across former Soviet territory, each one containing evidence of systematic killing that was denied for decades by governments that claimed moral authority. The truth began emerging only as the Soviet system collapsed under its own contradictions. In 1990, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev finally admitted Soviet responsibility for Katyn after 50 years of lies. Archival documents released during Glasnost revealed the full scope of systematic murder that had been hidden behind state secrecy and diplomatic protection. These crimes succeeded because they occurred in darkness, hidden behind the chaos of World War and protected by the absolute secrecy that only totalitarian states can maintain. The perpetrators understood a fundamental truth. Controlling information could make mass murder invisible to history, at least temporarily. The documentation survived because bureaucrats, even when committing atrocities, maintained their administrative systems. Evil, it turns out, creates its own evidence if anyone cares enough to look for it and has the courage to make it public despite political pressure. Today, as authoritarian regimes again attempt to reshape borders through violence and rewrite history through propaganda, the Soviet example provides a stark reminder of how systematic crimes against humanity actually operate. They don't announce themselves with dramatic speeches or obvious signs. They hide behind administrative efficiency, bureaucratic euphemisms, and official denial backed by state power. The victims of Soviet war crimes deserved more than unmarked graves and 50 years of official lies told by governments that claim to represent justice. They deserved a world that refused to let their murders disappear into the convenience of geopolitical silence and diplomatic accommodation with their killers. History's most important lesson may be its simplest. When we stop bearing witness to atrocities, when we allow political considerations to override moral clarity, we guarantee their repetition by future regimes that study how previous criminals escape justice.